Hundreds of migrant children across the United States are working long hours in grueling, often dangerous conditions in factories, farms, and mills. The kids are alone in the U.S., typically having fled their countries without their parents. Many are seeking asylum and other protections under U.S. and international law, a process that can take years and cost thousands of dollars. And as they wait, they're in need of ways to support themselves and, for many, to send money to their families back home. Overnight shifts and dangerous work violate multiple long-standing child labor laws. So how is this happening, and what does it say about how migrants are treated in the United States? That's our conversation this week in an UpFront special. Alone and exploited. Those are the opening words of a recent New York Times investigation that exposed widespread illegal employment of unaccompanied migrant children by corporations across the United States. Thousands of kids, some as young as 12 and 13 years old, are working grueling hours at highly dangerous jobs for prominent companies like Target, General Motors, Ford, and food processing giant Hearthside Food Solutions, which manufactures popular cereal brands Cheerios and Lucky Charms. The investigation describes children sawing planks of wood on overnight shifts, operating hazardous machinery, roofing houses, and working in slaughterhouses. So why is this happening on such a vast scale and in direct violation of U.S. and international labor laws? Joining us to discuss this are Hannah Dreier, an investigative reporter with the New York Times and author of the investigation Alone and Exploited: Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the U.S., and Mario Bruzzone, senior policy advisor at the Women's Refugee Commission's Migrant Rights and Justice Program. I want to thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Hannah, I want to start with you. You spoke with more than 100 migrant youth in 20 states across the United States who are working in highly dangerous, and I might add, illegal jobs. Many of these kids are laboring in brutal conditions, working punishingly long hours. According to some caseworker estimates, about 2/3 of unaccompanied migrant children in the U.S. work full time. That is mind-boggling to me. You said that it wasn't actually difficult to even find these kids, that this is happening more or less openly around the country. You talked to one 13-year-old, his name was Jose. He works on a commercial egg farm in Michigan, and he said to you, "I'd like to go to school, but then how would I pay rent?" Tell us about Jose. What is a typical day like for him?
Thank you so much for bringing attention to this, Mark. And I think that Jose is really typical of the kinds of kids that I was talking to. He came to this country because after the pandemic, there wasn't enough to eat in his home country in Guatemala. And he thought that life would be easier here. He thought maybe he could help send money home to his younger siblings. And so he came by himself at 13, and instead, what he found was that he had to pay rent, he had to support himself. Everything was much more expensive than he had imagined. And, this is a child making this decision, so how could he have known? And he was working 12-hour shifts, completely in violation of child labor laws, um, on an egg farm that supplies eggs around the country. And this is what I found again and again. And a lot of this reporting was as simple as going to the car part supplier that's supplying Ford Motors and just waiting at the shift change and watching the faces of the people who were coming out. And a 13-year-old looks like a 13-year-old. These kids admitted their ages right there in the parking lot. It wasn't hard reporting in that sense. And some of the adults who were working alongside them said that they'd been really troubled and they'd noticed that there were more and more kids on these overnight shifts, on these dangerous shifts. But the companies, when we talked to them, said they had no idea. They'd never noticed these young faces.
Mario, about 130,000 unaccompanied children crossed the southern border last year. They were seeking asylum in the United States. That's 3 times what it was 5 years ago. Can you explain why we're seeing this increase in children, specifically unaccompanied minors who are seeking asylum?
Yeah, it's a great question. So unaccompanied kids mostly come from 3 countries in Central America, from Guatemala, from Honduras, and from El Salvador. They tend to come from neighborhoods that are quite dangerous, where there's a lack of opportunity. And these are countries where corruption is rampant, in the case of Honduras, where there are widespread gangs that have territories and as well as territorial disputes that put kids' lives in danger, where those gangs may forcibly recruit children into those gangs at a certain age. And then in the case of Guatemala, you have an indigenous minority that is deeply discriminated against at basically every conceivable juncture. So what we find in the sort of outcome of that is this longstanding crisis of protection that happens to have come to a head in the past recent years, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a crisis of protection for children, but also for families, because parents care deeply about their children. The outcome of that crisis of protection is kids seeking asylum in the United States, a place where they can be safe, where they can have a future, have a life.
That's an interesting point that you raise around the families being so deeply invested in the safety and the well-being of their children, because one of the popular dominant media narratives is they don't care about their children. They're letting them go across the border. They're letting them go unaccompanied. They clearly don't care. Can you help us sort of make sense of that kind of narrative and why it's prevalent?
I can't speak to why it's prevalent other than it feels comfortable to believe, and it feels potentially comfortable to say that we don't have to do work as a country, as Congress, as American society. But what is happening here? These are kids, adults, young people want to have opportunities. They want to see themselves. They want to have a future. And if you live in a neighborhood where gangs are rampant, where that is the only way forward, and you don't want to participate, you don't have very many options. So what comes out of that are children who want to seek a different kind of life, a safer life, a better life. And the United States provides that opportunity, as we have for decades, centuries. And that's actually like a lovely thing about the country. That's a wonderful thing that we should be uplifting. And it's unfortunate that there is this discourse that you mentioned that treats it as if that's inappropriate.
If I could jump in, I mean, I talked to a lot of these parents back in their home countries and asked them exactly this question. Why did you send your child? Do you know that your child is living this life? And across the board, they told me that they wish that they could have come themselves. They would like to be the one working in the slaughterhouse and trying to send money home, or working in roofing while their child was back in Guatemala or in El Salvador, not working these really exploitative jobs. But they know that they are likely to be turned around at the border, whereas their child is likely to be allowed to come in and apply for asylum. And so, what I was hearing again and again is parents who wish that they could be in this country working, but know that they can't. And so, that's part of what's contributing to this wave of children coming across. More kids are coming. I also found that even in the most remote villages where volcanoes block cell phone service, people know this rule that if you're under 18, you are more likely to be allowed into the country. And that's a law in this country that goes back to 2008. It has to do with not wanting to expel children so that they're all alone in a border town where anything might happen to them. So we have a policy of letting children come in. But we don't have that policy, like you say, for adults, and it's getting harder and harder for adults to come into this country.
Yeah.
And I mean, Mario can speak to this more than me, but this is something that advocates often refer to as self-separation, where families are choosing to separate because of this phenomenon where children can come in, but their parents often can't.
I just wanted to add on to something that Hannah said. When we look deeply into the data of who's coming and where they're coming, one of the curiosities is that unaccompanied children's arrivals over time rise at the same time that family arrivals, so parents with children at the US border. What that suggests is that the decision for a child to go is largely about the pressure in home country. And the choice that the families make is whether that child is going by themselves or whether they're going with a family member. And that's a slightly different situation than a parent who might go instead of the child, right? It largely is, at least from the data that I see, which is talking about hundreds of thousands of these kids and families, about the pressure in home country and how they're going to make that journey. And the pressures at the border look like they are contributing to those families that have already decided that a child needs to leave because it's unsafe, to go by themselves because the child can get in, rather than going and making that journey in honestly a more safe manner to the US border with a parent or family member.
That makes sense. Now, Hannah, your investigation found that unaccompanied minors are working for not just companies, they're working for well-known corporations, many of them household names. There are brands like General Motors, Target, Walmart, just to name a few, who are mixed up in this stuff. In 2022, 835 companies in the United States were found to have violated child labor laws. Some kids have been seriously injured, even killed on the job. One 15-year-old in Alabama died when he was laying down shingles on a roof. and another 16-year-old was crushed under a 35-ton tractor scraper near Atlanta, Georgia. How does this stuff continue to happen? And how is it, frankly, that those of us, even who are well-read and well-informed, are barely hearing about it, if at all, until now?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that 16-year-old crushed under the tractor scraper. One thing that shocked me was that 16-year-old was actually driving that earth mover. I don't know how that happens, but I mean, when I started this reporting, I sort of figured that I would find some children working in agriculture, maybe working in restaurants. It's been an open secret, I think, in immigration world that a lot of the children who cross the border on their own end up working. And what I found instead was that kids were working in these completely industrial jobs. Like you say, in factories. I talked to kids who's told me that their lungs burned because they were working all night packing spicy Cheetos, and that spicy dust would irritate their lungs. I talked to children who had lost limbs at industrial meat packing plants. I mean, it's not the kind of work where you would ever expect to see a child. And labor inspectors say they never did see children in these kinds of workplaces in these numbers until really just the last few years. So that's been a huge shift. And I think it really goes back to lack of labor law enforcement and then just how alone these children are. Um, when a child crosses the border, they go to a government shelter, and then a government worker decides who's going to take care of them. They try to find an adult who can take responsibility and support that child. And what I found is that after children are released, there's almost no follow up for the majority of them.
But these are
So
still,
they're really
so,
on
so
their
I
own.
get how sort of our economic system, greed, lack of oversight produces this kind of predatory action from corporations. I guess what I'm finding surprising is that it's not, again, it's not the mom and pop shop. It's not the unknown, unnamed farmer who doesn't give a darn who's working the tractor. I mean, these are major corporations. I would think they'd be worried about lawsuits, bad image in the media. I would think they'd be worried about, even if they don't have any feelings about this, I thought they'd have interests that would make them less likely to have such spectacular displays of labor exploitation.
No, it's such a good point. And one thing is child labor law sounds like it's this big, serious thing. We have federal agents who enforce it. We also have state agents who enforce this law. But the maximum penalty for a violation is $15,000.
Oh my
So
God.
no matter what happens with the child, no matter how much they work, no matter what they're doing, a corporation is not going to pay more than $15,000, which for
And
a
there's no
lot of these
criminal penalty
companies,
for
they
this?
make that it's not generally a criminal matter. This is something that might now change. There's been a lot of pressure in the last couple of weeks since the story came out to maybe reform that law to make it a more serious penalty. But even if a child dies on the job, you mentioned that 15-year-old who fell 50 feet from a roofing job he should never have been doing. That was a $100,000 penalty for the death of a child, which again, for these companies, that's, nothing. That's change.
Mario, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, child labor violations have increased by almost 70% since 2018. Now, are we seeing more of a crackdown by authorities to ensure compliance, or has there just been an increase in actual violations?
I think it's both. I think you have a situation where these bad actors, as you called them, have figured out that there's a particular group of immigrant children who are exploitable for their labor and have largely moved toward that. You also have, with these increasing numbers, you have a sort of effect in which you have a big enough population in lots of different places where lots of different corporations, labor brokers, are able to exploit children for their labor. And I would say, too, going back to the last point, that that's part of the process as well. So a lot of these companies are not employing the people who work in the factories directly. Instead, they're using labor brokers, and that removes their legal liability, but the criminal
Can you
penalties
explain
and the
what's a
fines.
labor broker?
So that's a company, a contractor that says they're going to provide a group of laborers to some sort of setting.
And the labor broker is taking the responsibility for presenting legal, compliant workers, right? So the company's just saying, hey,
Correct.
we got them from the broker. I don't know anything about this.
Absolutely.
So why aren't we intensifying our crackdown, or at least our examination of the brokers? I mean, because it seems like the brokers are they directly know what they're doing.
I think it's a great question, and I think some of these have involved investigations into labor brokers. I know in the California ag sector, one of the things that happens is the companies dissolve very readily, and then they disappear in effect. So if there's no criminal liability, it's very easy for individuals to dissolve a corporation, have the corporation's headquarters disappear, the people involved sort of scatter, and then they reform a labor brokerage somewhere else, but with all of the social connections that they had before. I would expect that some version of that, some similar process would be happening in the manufacturing that Hannah's reporting unveiled.
Wow. Mario, another piece of this is the fact that the kids are not undocumented. Many are asylum seekers who've been processed. They're known by the United States government to be in the country. You know, that's a very big difference. There are a number of players who are involved in this process. You got the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is responsible for placing migrant children with sponsors. They're also supposed to provide care and protect them from exploitation. Then there's the Department of Labor. They have a duty to stop child labor violations, too. There's a lot of blame to go around here. We've talked about the brokers, we've talked about the corporations, but on the government side of things, who should we be looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are failures of protection, especially at the state and local level, that I think haven't got as much attention through this reporting and through the outcry as they really deserve. So states like Ohio and Iowa and Arkansas as well have been reducing the standards for child labor, made it easier for people to exploit child labor, to profit from child labor, reducing the protections, reducing the need for children to have appropriate safety equipment. That's all political choices, and those folks should be held accountable for those. In addition, states have really stepped back their enforcement of child labor laws over the past several decades. Ohio doesn't even have a Department of Labor, for instance.
What's the premise behind that, right? You know, I know when the right wants to dissolve things like the Department of Education, they say the state needs to be taking care of it, right? But on the state level, when you're dissolving things like labor oversight, what's the government what's the argument for that?
I assume it's some version of cutting red tape, Mark. I assume that their argument is to say something like, these are just inspections that are keeping businesses from going about their daily duties, and it just creates more red tape, it creates lawyers and legalisms, and doesn't promote entrepreneurialism or something like that.
Hannah, there's been a swift response to the investigation by elected officials. The Biden administration formed an interagency child labor task force, and U.S. lawmakers have introduced a bipartisan bill that would increase penalties on employers who violate child labor laws. Is enough being done to hold employers who exploit these children to account?
You know, there has really been swift action in the last several weeks in a way that never expected to see. I mean, I think every investigative reporter is used to putting stories out and sort of hoping one day something might change, or at least people can't say they didn't know. In this case, within 72 hours, the Department of Labor was really taking action. They're going to change the way that they enforce these laws. They're pledging to go up the chain and go after those big brands, not just the labor brokers. There's movement to increase the penalties for companies that break these laws. And the Department of Labor also is launching a task force with Health and Human Services. So I think we are truly going to see more enforcement. What is less clear is whether these children are going to have more support. And I think that would look like social workers looking after these kids once they're released, lawyers for these kids, more focus on making sure that sponsors understand the kind of responsibility that they truly are taking on. They can't just turn around and send these kids to the factory where they know they can get a job. Without sort of both of those things, I don't think there's, you know, that much reason to think that there won't just be another wave of kids coming in this summer who end up in similar jobs.
Yeah, I mean that's very consistent
that's
very consistent with our approach to many challenges, social challenges in the United States. Is we get tough, we militarize, we criminalize, we'll do all that, but the actual social investment, the economic investment in the vulnerable is something very different. And I think your investigation calls for all of it, but the kind of outrage people are getting or experiencing might be quelled by people saying, all right, we're going to get tough on all those exploitative companies.
Totally, because it's more, it's easier to say we're going to crack down. It's much harder to say we're going to solve this very complicated situation where vulnerable children need support. Immigration is such a politicized issue. It's hard to know, will we get more money to support these kids? Is there appetite to go out and make sure that they're less alone? But I mean, talking to advocates, talking to people who work within the government, who work most closely with these children on the ground, they say it really does need to be both sides of that equation.
Absolutely. Mario, the Biden administration also just unveiled a new immigration rule, officially called the circumvention of lawful pathways. Of course, human rights groups have many of them have referred to it as the asylum ban. The American Civil Liberties Union has spoken out against it, saying, quote, it would continue to restrict many families from accessing asylum together. How do you think the new so-called asylum ban would affect this issue of child exploitation? And do you think the enforcement mechanisms on corporations are enough to actually address the problem?
So the Women's Refugee Commission is adamantly against the rule as well. We have also spoken out against it several times. For your viewership, for anyone who may not be familiar, the proposed rule would make it extremely difficult for anyone to get asylum in the United States if they'd passed through a country where they could have asked for asylum previously but did not. What the effect of this rule is, or will have on families, we think, is a number of families will travel together, as we've discussed earlier in this program, to the US border. They will find out at the US border that they do not qualify for asylum in the United States, and they will be confronted with the horrific choice to either send the child across the border alone, because unaccompanied children are excluded from the rule, or to remain in a dangerous situation in Mexico, where we've seen horrific things happen to asylum seekers, crimes committed against them, all sorts of really terrible situations, but remain intact there. That choice is cruel and it's horrifying, and we are adamantly opposed to it. I would also say that the rule is misconceived as policy. So even if you think that too many people who don't really have a chance at asylum are applying for asylum, that doesn't mean that an individual shouldn't be allowed to present their case for protection. And then on top of that, if the process is bad, if people are evading a process, that's not a cause for migration. That's the cause of a bad process, a bad asylum process. And so the rule sort of is misconceived as policy. It also is going to hurt a lot of vulnerable people. And for that reason, WRC is adamantly against it. In terms of the labor question that you asked a moment ago, or what we can do, we have a number of things that we think will help on the social services side. So increasing what's called a warm handoff between those government shelters and the local social service providers, making sure that kids and their sponsors have all of the access to materials to support that they need, and providing all of these kids with lawyers, because the lawyers often backstop the children's sort of protection needs. So if a child is in a situation, they're going through their court case, because they're actually in immigration limbo when they're here. So they're known to the government, but they're in immigration limbo. The lawyer helps them do that, but also helps with things like identifying exploitative employers, making sure that they get protection, making sure they get access to services, making sure all of their needs are met. So those are the two things that we would really promote on that services front.
Hannah, he's describing just such an impossible set of choices that people have to make at the border, and a set of rules, sometimes masquerading as policies, and a set of economic and political structures that don't seem particularly responsive to the challenges that we're facing. How do we see our way out of this?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I came back to again and again in this reporting. Like, how is it that in 2023, this country can't keep young children out of the most dangerous, brutal, overnight, industrial kind of work? And a lot of it comes down to these issues of global inequity. What do you do when you have people who are very close to the United States who are starving in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Honduras, where life has become untenable? And the US is sort of this beacon of a better life. People still see it as a place where they can go and try to improve their lot, help their families. And some of these issues are, intractable. And so we come back to these things like, well, at least give these kids lawyers, at least make this a real violation, not a sort of violation on paper that nobody cares about. But, it's been sort of wrenching to talk to hundreds of these kids and their families and just confront the terrible choices that they have to deal with day in and day out.
Hannah, thank you so much for joining me. Mario, thank you so much for joining me on UpFront. All right, that is our show, UpFront. We'll be back next week.